economic prosperity. And that engine is that whole system is threatened by years of neglect at the state level. Oh, I got that in there twice. Okay, where are we today? Like what we do at C is we obviously are down at the legislature. We are bringing the concerns of our districts down to the state, and we lobby on their behalf. And what has happened is, if you haven't heard, Minnesota has a deficit. Probably most everybody knows that. Last session, they had a $3 billion deficit. And they solved that, 2/3 of that deficit by going to the schools. What they did is they shifted aid payments to our schools. Before then, the state paid 90% of what they owed our schools in the current year so they could pay their bills, and then the other 10% they gave the next year, kind of when you wrap up your financials. It made sense, so they paid the right amount. Well, if they change that to 70% in the current year and 30% in the following year, on the books, it looks like they just spent over $1.5 billion less because they shoved that money into the next fiscal year. It's kind of like if your boss came up to you in October and said, you know what, times are tough. I'm not going to pay your salary for the rest of the year. I'll give it to you in January. Hey, I'm good for it, and you still got a job. And you're like, yeah, that's good, I still got a job. But you're not going to get paid for the next 3 or 4 months. You're thinking, oh, I still got mortgage payments, I still got to feed my kids, I still got to heat my house. But you are also thankful that you got a job. So what do? If you have fun, if you were smart and wise and not how Americans have generally been, you might have saved up 3 or 4 months of money in your savings account, and you could live off that, and most likely you were going to have to put some of those expenses on your credit card, and you pay the fees instead of your employer for borrowing the dollars. So that's kind of what the state of Minnesota did. And so they did that, and then separate to that, this is kind of the double whammy. There is in law, separate from the shift that I just talked about, the state of Minnesota now, because they have actually gone through every reserve, they've gone through all the cushions in the couch looking for money, they've gone under the beds, there is no money left. So what they have is a cash flow problem. It means kind of like when they have to make big payments, does not match up with when they get big revenue in from maybe sales tax or your income tax. So you know, it's kind of like when you have a whole lot of month left at your paycheck. That's kind of what Minnesota finds himself into. And in law it says before they can short-term borrow, they can withhold aid payments to our schools. So even if our schools were smart enough to have a reserve, the state can come in and take those away until the end of the fiscal year. Again, they legally pay back on June 30th, but they can take the reserve out of from schools, not all of it, but some of it. Anything over, the law says $350, I think they're taking anything over $700 per pupil. So you know, people are saying that education hasn't been part of the solution on the budget debate, and I'm saying, oh yeah, we have. The problem is, this legislative session, the budget is worse. We have a $5 billion deficit. And right now, the legislature actually, and the governor, have matched proposals and are all funding education at base level. They're holding it harmless. But because of that, they are going to have to do some serious things in a cut-only budget. And so just how big is this deficit? If we cut all kids from health care, eliminate all cash welfare, shut down 20% of our nursing homes, cut salaries 10% for all branches of government, eliminate all local government aid, close all state parks, eliminate House and Senate per diem, shut down 10 state college campuses, and cut all state operations by 50%, that only reaches $3.6 billion of the $5 billion deficit. Actually, what they're doing this year is they're extending that shift, so they got the school shift where they delay the payment, and that's about $1.4 million. So they could slap that down and indeed handle the budget deficit without any increased revenue, but I'm not sure if that's the state we all want to live in. So what's happening directly to education? Actually, the legislature is wrapping up tomorrow, and then they're going back to their communities for the traditional Easter Passover break. And many of them are going to be in your community. So we've been asked to generate some basic talking points about what the legislature is proposing this year. There's two key concepts. We are thankful at the current level of funding for schools. They have prioritized education at the state level. But what they're doing is they're announcing that they are giving new money to schools. They're increasing the basic formula by, I put it up there, like $31 and $50 each year. The problem with that is to get the funding from that, they took or eliminated that automatic 4.6% growth factor for special education. That's where that dollars are coming from next year. And the following year, they eliminated integration aid that primarily funds Minneapolis and probably about 100 other districts who have racial disparity in their community. So I think we should understand that if you take funding that is intended for special education and you call it new money, that's not so, because we have seen special education costs go up 8% a year. They're taking away the 4.6% growth factor. Any new money is going to have to go right back to paying that rising cost. So we need, the general public says, hey, schools got more money, and again, it's like, oh, we're still playing that shift game. The other main talking point is that caution against reform. Reforms, they have so much reform in the finance bills. You're not supposed to have policy in finance bills. You're supposed to have policy in policy bills, but they have a whole bunch in the finance bills that are in conference committee right now. Although they are providing some mandate relief, they are adding so much more. There is a provision in there that's professional development and teacher evaluation where they're requiring all school administrators to evaluate teachers at least twice a year. Most of our schools with probationary teachers do it every year, but maybe do it once every 2 or 3 years. If that becomes a requirement, our schools, most are going to have to hire additional administration. One of my biggest fears is if we actually have to hire administration in these tough economic times, what our communities will do. They really do not like administrative increases in our schools. They want to see it going into the classroom. So this mandate could cause a lot of public relation problems because they're not giving us any new money and they're asking for a lot of reform. So I didn't bring it, but I do have the complete talking list that I can give you that talks more about the bills. I made copies of it, I'll print it by the front. But it's a lot of good things in the bill as far as policy that we might want to look at. But we need caution because we just can't afford any more unfunded mandates. So a little bit, as they talk about solving that deficit, there's a lot of pressure to look at education cuts. Because they say education is 40% of the budget, how can it not be cut? It is true that education is 40% of the undesignated budget. That is the funding that the legislatures actually control. But if you look at all funding and you include dedicated funding streams, which education doesn't have, but for example, we have a gas tax for transportation, we have the license fees for the DNR, we have health impact fees and health access fees for Health and Human Services. There's a lot of money that comes in that is directed that the legislature can't control. And if you look at that, the square or the circle on the right, education actually is only 25.5% of the budget. Of all money that comes into the state of Minnesota, only 25% goes to our schools. On top of that, since 2004, it has dropped from almost 28%. So we are really not prioritizing education as much as everybody wants us to believe. The biggest thing, as we know, is the growth of health and human services. It's the health care costs again, and that is consuming the state budget, and it will eventually squeeze out everything. So there's a lot of concern there in the long run. So why should everybody care? Well, Tom Stinson is a state economist, and Tom Galipsy, the Toms, the state demographer, are highly respected nonpartisan experts down at the state. And they have been warning of this for years. They are telling us that the future prosperity of Minnesota depends on a highly educated workforce. And the reason being is that our workforce is shrinking. Our baby boomers are retiring, and there's not as many children behind them. In just a few years, for the first time ever, we are going to have more people over 65 than we have in our schools. That's never happened before. So with this declining workforce, we need every worker to be more productive, more creative, better critical thinkers, more entrepreneurial, so that we can have a strong economy with a smaller workforce. In fact, this summer, a research came out that said in the country, by 2018, just 7 years from now, 63% of the jobs will require education beyond high school. In Minnesota, 70% of the jobs will require education beyond high school. This doesn't mean that everybody needs to get a 4-year college degree. They can get a technical degree, a 2-year college degree, but the jobs demands are going to require that additional schooling. So what I always like to point out is this great connection that education doesn't only equal success for the individuals, but it also is the prosperity for Minnesota because of this inverse, really kind of good relationship that you have. This looks at how much schooling you have and what happens to your unemployment chances as well as your earnings. And what happens is the higher you go in the educational attainment, you make more money and you're less likely to be unemployed. Good thing. And what's really important is that cutoff where you get out of living in poverty and become a productive citizen. And that is really going to be with the associate degree and above in our future economy. So can we afford to invest in education? Aren't we already one of the highest tax states? Back in, 92 or 94, the Chamber of Commerce came up with this way of measuring the size of government. They call it the price of government. And it is the total state and local revenue as a percentage of personal income. It's kind of, that indicator, how much taxes are we paying as a percentage of our income. And of course, the intent is to shrink that number down, so we're paying less and less into taxes. And as you can see, we've been pretty successful in Minnesota of bumping that number down. And then how has that impacted our tax rating? Well, in the 80s, indeed, our ranking as a percentage of total state and local taxes, as a percentage of our income, we were in the top 10, and now we've dropped down to 23rd. I know nobody will ever believe this, but Minnesota is kind of an average tax state in the nation. What has been the impact on education funding during that same time period? This looks at the total public spending as a percent of our personal income again. In the 80s and 90s, we were bouncing around in the 14th to the 25th percent in the nation. We are now hovering at 40th in the nation of how much money we're willing to put into our public school system as a percentage of our income. So that has been part of the byproduct of kind of trying to shrink our government down. So what can you do? I'm done now. I always put a few things down sometimes, but we really need to get involved, and we really need to, if those of us that care, let our legislators who are making important decisions at funding and policy know that their constituents value education. So find out what you can, sign up for my updates. I do write weekly legislative updates during the session. I talk about what's going on and how that would impact our districts and that sort of thing. And then at really critical times, I'll also suggest that you contact your legislators now and maybe give you suggestions on sample letters. So I just want to kind of engage people in the talk and in the process because it is a political world, and the greasy or the squeaky wheel gets the grease is the way to do it. So spread the words. Our schools are doing good things, but yet we hear a lot of negative things about our schools. Those of us that support our schools need to be talking about the good things that happen to match the rhetoric of the other side. And I always put in there support local referendums. If we're serious at looking at the state's economy, I don't see any increases in education funding for at least 4 years. So that districts might be even more reliant on referendum revenue in the future. And then one of the old ones, but in 2 years, everybody in the state all the legislators in the state of Minnesota are up for re-election, and we should make education a campaign issue. So that's what I have. I am done, and I certainly would be happy to answer any questions.
On that graph where it started out 70% approximately,
yeah.
And then the line went the other way, back up.
Mm-hmm.
What is the state doing with that disparity money?
Oh, it goes into the general fund, and they just use it. They pay less and less money into equalization.
And the other part of that question is the education was originally funded from the land and all that property that the state owns, and that has been eaten up by the DNR and whatever. Is there any hope of turning that back around?
Okay, he's talking about the school trust lands.